Welcome to the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. In the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show, we are joined by special guests talking about their experiences, their realities of investigating crimes, plus those who have experienced horrendous trauma. Police, first responders, military, and victims of crime share their stories. Hi, I'm John J. Wiley. In addition to being a broadcaster, I'm also a retired police sergeant. Be sure to check out our website, letradio.com, and also like us on Facebook. Search for the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. If you want to be a guest on the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show, simply contact us. It couldn't be easier. You can send us a message on Facebook. Look for and like the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show page, or email jay@letradio.com. That's JAY@letradio.com. Calling us from Northern California, we have Janelle Perez on the phone. Janelle is a former law enforcement officer and also an author. She's author of the book, The Moral Police. Janelle, thanks for being a guest on the show. Very much appreciated.
Yes, great to be here. Thank you.
Before we go into your career and your background, tell us about your book, The Moral Police, what it's about, where people can get more information, where people can buy it.
So my book, The Moral Police, is on Amazon. You can find it there. It is about my experience at my last police agency. I worked there for 8 months. It's an agency outside of Sacramento, California. And I faced some circumstances that I felt were discriminatory based on my gender and marital status. And so I talk about that in my book. I give a little bit of background into my life before my police work, and then take you through a subsequent court case that I had filed due to my termination from my last agency. So that's in a nutshell what it's about. You
were fired. Basically, the long and short of it is, this is something that happens quite often. You were fired because you had a relationship with another officer in your department.
That's right, an off-duty relationship. I was separated from my husband at the time of our relationship, and I was terminated. I was on probation at the time. He was not, and he was not terminated.
Right.
So.
I'm glad you brought that up. And here's the sad, unfortunate thing. Before we go into it, you were in law enforcement before. You were an experienced officer. You took a break for a while, then joined this agency. And a lot of police that leave one department for another one tend to forget they're no longer considered experienced when they get there. They're still probationary. And when you're a probationary officer, you can be fired for almost anything.
Yes, that's a very true statement, and I understood that from the beginning. I think what was hard for me to swallow was that I felt like I was discriminated based on, my marital status and gender. And there are some protected reasons where you cannot be terminated even if you are on probation, and that's kind of what I was standing by. So
I'm glad you brought that up. The book is called The Moral Police, and I'm sorry that you went through this, and I'm sorry that your career was ended, because from what I understand, you weren't ready to be out of law enforcement.
Yeah, I was, I was enjoying a good career, and I didn't see it stopping. I took a short break when I had my second child, and then I came back into it, and I wasn't ready to stop. So it was career ending for me, unfortunately, but I think it's, opening other doors. So I'm trying to take the positive out of it.
Good. And you've been out of law enforcement how long now?
I was terminated back in 2012, so it's been a while.
And what are you doing now?
Well, I'm a full-time mom. That takes up most of my time, but I work part-time for an au pair agency as a child care consultant, and I love that because it provides me kind of an outlet outside of just being a mom, and I love the cultural diversity aspect. So
look for Janelle's book, The Moral Police. Do a Google search. That's what I did. Janelle Perez, The Moral Police. It's on Amazon. You'll find it right there, and I'm sure it's a great read. Your entire career was, almost 8 years?
Almost seven years.
Okay. And you started off with an agency near San Francisco, am I correct?
Correct, yes, in the Bay Area.
And before we go into that, a lot of people come from a background in law enforcement. They have law enforcement in their family. I didn't. My dad was a career Navy guy. I spent many years in a high school seminary. Thought I wanted to be a priest. That wasn't my calling in life. I went to law enforcement. But you didn't come from that background, did you?
I did not. No, my background is not traditional, I guess, in the sense I've met a lot of police officers who had law enforcement in their background. But mine was, I grew up playing competitive tennis, and that was my only focus. So if you asked me as a teenager what I was going to do, I was going to be a professional tennis player. That would have been my answer. So when I got to college, I really did not know what I wanted to study. I remember meeting with my academic counselor, and he told me, find something that interests you. And so that really stuck with me because in my background growing up, I had seen a lot of my family members involved with drugs and alcohol. I had a relative who was an alleged gang member in my family, and, I was very interested in criminal justice. So I studied criminal justice in college, and then when I moved back to California after I graduated, I was like, okay, it's time to, start a career. What am I going to do? And I really didn't think I was going to go, become a police officer, but it was an opportunity that was presented, and I decided to give it a try. And when I got into, out of the academy and into real life being a police officer, I really loved the career. So
I still have fond memories, and I'll be honest, I have people ask me all the time, are you glad you're out of it? I'm glad I'm retired nowadays, the way the culture is. Would I go back and do it all over again? Probably. I loved it. I worked with great people. I worked in a great part of Baltimore. The citizens were phenomenal. We had a lot of hardcore criminals, don't get me wrong, but the vast majority of people weren't that way.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say overall my experience in law enforcement was wonderful. I met a lot of amazing people, not just coworkers, but also people in the community. That was really important to me, outreach in the community. I remember fondly, memories of volunteer activities that I did. And, I'm the same way. There's a lot of, there's some bad memories and a lot of bad people that I encountered, but overall the career was great. So
one of the things that we had so many calls for, and the drugs and alcohol, it's funny that it could become a prominent problem for a lot of people in law enforcement, but it's something that we handle calls for service for all the time. Family disputes, family problems, domestic disputes, usually alcohol and or drug fueled. And to go from that background growing up and experience in law enforcement, do you find that rather ironic?
Yeah, I really believe that it gave me, I had a really good perspective. I was able to see both sides. I wasn't just looking at somebody thinking, okay, you're committing a crime. I can see, the other side. All these family members, that have had addictions, they were good people. I knew them to be very good people. They just had an addiction. And a lot of very similar, when I arrested people in my career, drugs were often involved with identity theft, with the guns, everything. Drugs were often involved. And so I think I was really fortunate, and ironically, to have that background because I was able to see people for who they were. They had an addiction problem, and they weren't bad people. They just made some bad choices. And I always hoped that, arresting them, I was hoping, this is the last time. I kept hoping that for, I'd arrest some people several times, and I always hoped that this was the last time and this would be their wake-up call.
And we're talking with Janelle Perez. Janelle is a former law enforcement officer. She's also author of the book, The Moral Police. When we return, we're going to talk more about drugs and alcohol background in law enforcement and their experience working gangs. This is the Law Enforcement Show. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back. Don't you hate when they do the bait and switch on you? When they tell you, check out a website, and it's free to go there, and then there's hidden charges? You won't find any of that nonsense at our website, letradio.com. It's free. It's always been free, and it costs you absolutely nothing. There's no hidden tricks. letradio.com. Check it out today. You can find episodes of the show as available as a podcast after airing on radio. They're always free, always have been, and always will be. Again, that's letradio.com, where it's always free. Back to our conversation with Janelle Perez, former law enforcement officer, also author of the book, The Moral Police. Do a Google search for The Moral Police, and you'll find it on Amazon, all kinds of locations. online. Before we end the break, Janelle, we're talking about, you grew up in a background where, first of all, I find it fascinating. You were a competitive tennis player and wanted to be a tennis pro when you grew up. So many of us wanted to be pro athletes when we were little and then realized I just wasn't that good. It sounds to me like you were pretty good at it, but maybe just the difference between like a pro football player and a high school standout is small percentages.
Yeah, I was definitely gifted. I was good at what I did. I think what I lacked was the passion. So I was, I played I started playing when I was 5 and played all the way up through college, and I think I was just a little bit burnt out. So
yeah, those people are all in, and they got to be. I don't care what sport it is. They got to be all in from day one, and that's their entire lives. And yeah, before we get back to our conversation, I see football players on television getting hurt and they're crying. And the first reaction you have is like, well, yeah, they're a little bit of a wuss, being a little wimpy. But the truth is, this is someone who's trained at this for 20 years of their life, and then they have potentially a career-ending injury. And I never really thought of it that way. So I find it even more fascinating that you were a competitive tennis player. You came from a background where you were experiencing in your family issues of drug and alcohol abuse and how that affected your family. Did that affect you deeply?
I have to give credit to my dad. I mean, he was pretty hard on me, but he kept me away from all of it. So I think that's why he got me into tennis so young, to do something positive in my life. He wouldn't let me play video games. He wouldn't let me go to the mall. It was literally tennis all the time. And I think, he saw what was happening in his own family, and so I think he did me a great service by keeping me out of it. But I still, now that I'm a grown-up, I hear more of the stories about what has happened, with several of my family members, and it makes me sad, but I'm grateful that my dad, kind of kept me out of that for the most part.
Yay for dads, especially the hard ones, they're all right. Because I'll let you know a little secret. I can be a bit of a hard, sometimes with my adult daughters. But we joke about that. One of the things that you brought up in the background before we went to break, growing up, you became more aware of the consequences and of people suffering from drug and alcohol abuse and addiction. And by the way, if you have someone in your life who has a problem with drugs and or alcohol, I always tell people this: if they're breathing in and out, there's hope for them. Don't ever give up hope. They can get better. They can recover. They can have really great lives. So don't throw them out. I'm not saying enable them. Find what makes you happy, what works for them, and hopefully they'll get there. I say this all the time. In prisons, we have people that, had 10 minutes of their life that were bad, made a wrong decision. We have people that are in there due to drugs and alcohol. If it wasn't for drugs and alcohol, they'd never be in prison. And then you have a small, very small percentage who are hardcore career criminals. And people need to differentiate between those. And however, when someone does something under the influence of alcohol and or drugs, it doesn't matter. It doesn't take away the impact on the victim. That was victim. And it is an old metaphor, analogy, or whatever people want to use. Look, if I break someone's nose in a fist fight, it doesn't matter whether I was drunk or sober when I did it. Their nose is equally as broken, and they go through as much pain either way. So, and one of the things that happened in my career, you came on after me, is an incident in Torrington, Connecticut, changed the way we handle domestic disputes. And it was big case law that came of it. There was lawsuits, everything else. From that point on, if we saw any signs of injury on anybody in domestic or felt that if we left that they'd be in danger, we had to lock people up. And there was no choice no matter whatsoever. It didn't matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's the same, in my career. If there's any visible injury, you have to make an arrest. But, what you said about, if you're under the influence of alcohol or drugs, they have to be responsible for their decisions. I think the side that, I tried to always maintain was treating people with respect. It goes a long way. We're all human beings. We all make mistakes, police officers included.
Sure.
It's one of those things that I think respect, and for me, it went a long way in my career to keep me out of fights, just regular old human respect for people.
We were taught that the rule of thumb from day one as a rookie, we were taught respect everyone always, especially in your own home, until they change the tone of the conversation. And then there's no backing down. But we didn't walk into someone's house and be disrespectful. It just wasn't done because it made perfect sense. You don't do that. And he didn't do it on a street corner because inevitably it winds up pushing someone into a corner where they're going to have to lash out.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that for me personally, I'm a smaller individual. I'm not, I'm not 6'3" and have that physical presence. So I used my voice a lot in law enforcement. That was one of my assets. And, I'm right there with you. If you're disrespected, something happens, a situation escalates, you have to take action. You can't just sit back. But, for me personally, in my experience, that respect in my voice went a long way with people. So.
Eventually in your career, you started gravitating towards gang enforcement, gang investigation. Is that a big problem on the West Coast, more so on the East Coast?
I know from my experience in the county that I worked, we did have gang pockets in certain cities, and I did work a countywide gang task force for a couple summers. And I would say that was earlier in my career. I maybe had a year and a half to 2 years on at that point. And so I honestly, I was a pretty new officer. But boy, was it a wake-up call going into these different cities. I remember going into East Palo Alto and my first stopping a car with 3 occupants. We ended up searching them all. I was searching the driver. She had a gun in her waistband. And that was really just the setting for how things kind of went for me in the gang unit. There were a lot of guns, a lot of drugs. We did do some responsive where we would respond if there was a shooting or a stabbing in a certain city in the county, but most of it was proactive police work. And I loved my time on the gang unit. I learned so much so fast, but I think, it was really the foundation for me becoming a very proactive police officer. I did not like to just be reactive and respond to calls for service. I was very much into being proactive and making sure my beat where I worked in the city was cleaned up. People knew how to find me. That was really my goal. So.
When I worked in Baltimore, we didn't have a big gang problem. We had gangs, street crews, drug gangs, all those things. I worked primarily violent Jamaican drug organizations. They called themselves posses. They had members that were supposedly trained in guerrilla warfare by Cuban forces called Jungle Lights. But we didn't have the aspect you talk about where you have known organized gangs, whether it be motorcycle-related gangs or street gangs or that nature. We return to the Law Enforcement Show. We're going to be talking more with Janelle Perez about gangs, gang enforcement, and a lot of misconceptions that Americans have about gangs and the violence that they inflict on each other. This is the Law Enforcement Show. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Here's another location where you can find all kinds of news for free. That's medium.com, spelled medium.com. Look for the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show and Podcast profile on the Medium app and follow it. Turn conversation with Janelle Perez. Janelle is a former law enforcement officer from Northern California, also author of the book, The Moral Police. Do a Google search or go to Amazon and type in The Moral Police. Get more information about the book and get your copy today. When we were talking before the break, Janelle, we're talking about gangs, gang enforcement. I worked narcotics. I worked what a lot of people call flex units. We call them special operations, patrol. I was detailed at DEA for almost 2 years doing drug investigations and got promoted to sergeant and finished my career as a patrol sergeant. We didn't really have an organized gang unit in Baltimore. I know places like New York do, but it seems to be the West Coast. I remember watching movies like Colors and other things like that where gang units, LAPD, San Francisco, all those areas in the West Coast, it seems to be either they're more aggressive about it, they're more proactive about it, or they have a bigger gang problem than we do over here.
Yeah, I'm not sure, since I haven't worked on the East Coast, but I know from my experience here in Northern California, my first agency definitely had more of a gang problem than my second agency, and I felt like they were pretty proactive when I started there. They had started a gang unit. It was essentially just weekends, so Friday and Saturday when we had more gang problems, and it was in addition to your patrol shift. So I picked up a lot of that, and then I was lucky to get on the gang task force for a few summers, and that was countywide. But there are definitely, I would say, if I go down throughout the county and look at each city has a gang problem. There's different gangs. A lot of them are Hispanic street gangs. I know I've had dealings with the Bloods and Crips out of San Francisco. So it just, really, like, there's a lot more gang problems, I think, than people just see, that they don't realize in the cities that they live in. I have some not so great memories of, doing probation searches at 13, 14-year-old boys' houses, and come to find out that they've been, shot in a neighboring city and murdered. And those are some of the unfortunate, memories I wish I didn't have. Those were just little kids. And I think, going into my experience working with gangs, I think it's so important to start young and talk about gangs, drugs, all of those things that come along, because oftentimes in my experience, what I saw was these kids got into these gangs and they couldn't get out. There was no way out of them for them. So that was a hard reality. And, I did know a lot of the kids that I interacted with who they were murdered. And that was a really hard part of the job.
We look at New York, we look at like Miami, Atlanta. Gangs exist all up and down the East Coast. A good example of what I see in the news a lot is Chicago and the politicization by politicians about gangs and gang databases, things of that nature. They've divided gangs on ethnicity, race, whatever, and they're saying by keeping gang databases, it's a racist or ethnic bias, so they're eliminating them. Have you seen or heard the same happening on the West Coast?
Well, I have not heard that since I've been out of law enforcement, but what I know that I had to do is we had to document every contact we had. And so there was a gang database, and that information went in there. I remember taking, I had several trainings learning how to identify gang tattoos and what gang tattoos meant, and we had to make sure that got entered into the database. So I don't know anything of the database stopping, but I think it's important because I remember searching for people based on tattoos that they had and things like that. And so I think having that database is useful to the police. So,
is it fair to say that a lot of the gangs are divided up either by geographics or by ethnicity?
Yes, absolutely. In my experience, it's ethnicity and also area. Sometimes we had feuds from neighboring cities that were the same, they were all Norteños, for example, but they feuded with each other because they were in different cities. So I think that's fair to say. We had some of that, Janelle, where you had Jamaican drug gangs from D.C., Washington, D.C., coming up to Baltimore, and there would be big drive-bys and shootouts and vice versa going down. And I'm just saying that because that's the group I worked. It's what I'm familiar with. I know that there are other gangs in that area. Back then, they weren't as strong as they are today, but I don't have experience, so I'm not comfortable talking about something I haven't experienced. Yeah, I've been, I've been out of my first agency since 2010, so it's been a while, so I can't speak to how the gangs are today down there, but I just know from my experience, they definitely, the cities in the county down there did try to be more proactive by putting more police on it with that high police presence and really wanting a lot of contact down there. So I can't speak to if they're worse or better than 10 years ago, but I know during the time that I was there, they were prevalent enough to need gang units. So more police presence, more police activity was beneficial when it came to combating violent gangs? I think so. So, and I think, just talking with people, like, honestly, for me, like I talked about respect, I was, when we stopped people, if you had a good rapport with them, they might tell you something like, hey, you should probably come back around here tonight around 9, and that was just them telling you, like, something might go down and, you might need to be in this area. So I think, high police presence in those areas did deter some crimes from happening, not that they might not have happened later elsewhere. And, that was a big part of our unit, but a lot of contacts, enforcement stops, identifying people who are gang members, getting them entered into the system, those were a big part of our job.
So many people are reluctant, in my opinion, to classify anyone as a member of a gang because they're so afraid of being labeled as racist or biased or something of that nature. And it's very obvious. So we have people of all walks of life, all races, all ethnic backgrounds, and the vast majority of them don't get involved in criminal gangs.
Yes, that's true. I think from my perspective, identifying a gang member is, identifying a gang member, and it doesn't need to be looked at as, being something that's racist. It's just, if they have a dot on one hand and 3 dots on the other, there's a good chance that they're a gang member. Certain tattoos you can identify, certain clothing they wear. There's ways to identify. Maybe they're not full-blown members, maybe they're associates, but I think it's important even for officer safety, having that sort of information documented. So in my experience in law enforcement, like, I did not once did I hear that, documenting was something that I was doing that was racist.
With all the push for defunding police, one of the things I always say is I know people want to view that as a way of punishing police departments, but what it winds up doing, in my opinion, is punishing the communities that those departments police and patrol, especially when you look at things like violent organized gangs. When we talk about a gang, and I'm not mentioning names because I just don't believe in doing that, but what are they typically into?
What are gangs into? Is that what you're saying?
When your experience, what kind of criminal behavior were they involved in?
I'd say with my experience, a lot of drugs and, maintaining their area, their street credit, that was probably the most that I saw was the drug involvement, and obviously with the drugs came guns and having those weapons illegally. Those were, I would say, the biggest two.
We're going to take a short break. We're talking with Janelle Perez. Janelle is a former law enforcement officer from Northern California. She's also the author of the book, The Moral Police. Do a Google search for The Moral Police or Janelle Perez, and you'll find both. This is Law Enforcement Show. You can find us on Facebook. Look for and like the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show Facebook page. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
Got questions about your Medicare coverage? Who doesn't? Take a few moments to get real answers and options, all for free. Call 866-427-1225. 866-427-1225. 866-427-1225. Or visit lethealthy.com. lethealthy.com. lethealthy.com to learn more.
Return conversation with Janelle Perez. Janelle is a former law enforcement officer, also author of the book, The Moral Police. Do a Google search for The Moral Police. Just go to Amazon.com, type in The Moral Police, and you'll find it. One of the hardest things about my career in law enforcement, and by the way, I did a little over 11 years, got hurt and retired. And it was an act of violence at the end of my career. It was over very quickly. I wasn't ready for it to be over with, and it was a big adjustment afterwards. But one of the hardest things in my career, Janelle, was when we had moments of downtime, especially in the warmer weather. We get a chance to talk to the neighborhood kids on our posts. And then seeing some of them and being there when they took their last breath 4 or 5 years later when they got involved in a drug game. And they shorted the drug dealer one time too many, or got ripped off, or a competitor shot them. And I don't know that I could even come up with the right words nowadays to say, I knew this kid when he was 12, and I'm there, and I'm the last person they see when they're 16 and they're bleeding out in the street. Those sort of things had a tremendous impact on me.
Yeah, I think that's exactly how I feel as well. You build these relationships and you have these contacts, especially with some of these kids when you're doing regular probation searches, things like that. You see them at their school and you get to know who they are and you know that they're involved in a gang and that sort of thing. But I guess maybe being naive, you don't think that, they're going to die next month, for example. And I think that's what I really struggled with, was young kids losing their lives to the gang violence. That was probably the most traumatic, the hardest thing that I had to experience. Being involved with the gangs was seeing those kids lose their lives. I mean, they were just starting, but they didn't know how to get out of what they were into. And so, talking to the parents and having the parents cry on your shoulder and that sort of thing, those are all, you can really sympathize with them. Those are their children. They weren't bad people. And so to their parents, and so that's just one of the things that has always stuck with me was, the loss of life so young. So I think that's where I'm a big advocate of, really getting into these kids when they're young and, giving them, other outlets, whether it be, like a Boys and Girls Club where they can go after school, but not getting involved in that gang lifestyle.
So would you advocate after school activities like Boys and Girls Club?
I think anything that is giving them something to do instead of giving them, they're going back to their street corner and thinking of, crimes to commit or people to rip off or something like that. I'm definitely an advocate of being involved in activities after school. I think it's important, and I also think it's important for kids to hear from other people and see what else is out there. Maybe their parents are working and they never see their parents because it's a single mom that has, 3 or 4 jobs and they don't see her till she gets home at 10 at night. Maybe they need, role models in their life. Maybe they need those people to be telling them, hey, you can go to college. These are all these career options you can do. I think that would be, very beneficial to some of these younger kids that don't have those role models.
I met so many kids that had never been more than 2-3 miles from where they lived on my post. Maybe they got to go downtown the Inner Harbor once in their life. That's all they knew. They knew the street crime in their area. That's all they really had experience with.
Yeah, I remember vividly a memory. I was in San Francisco, and I was actually working out. I don't remember, I was maybe 14 years old, and this is when a relative of mine, I saw him at the park, and he was talking about drugs, and he was younger than me, and I was very confused. At this point in my life, I'm not exposed to any of this, and, this is the relative of mine that ended up, getting involved in gangs, and I think, looking back now, because I know a lot more now than I did then, he had some very, very, very hard struggles in his life coming up, and he really could have benefited from some role models. So I think, however, I don't have all the answers to all the problems in the world, but I think for kids, having, some structure and some role models and some positive after-school activities could really benefit them.
So I guess in closing, what would you say to, whether it be parents, teachers, community activists, what would you suggest to them that they do to try to help keep kids out of this horrible gang environment?
It's so hard because, gangs for a lot of these kids become families that they don't have at home. It's their family away from family, the family that they wish they had. And so I really think education at a young age is so important because a lot of the experience I have working the gang unit and talking with gang members is they can't get out of it once they're in. And so I think having that education early on in the schools, after-school activities, maybe role models, having one-on-one, somebody assigned to the kids, maybe that start struggling. I think any of those ideas could really be positive for them in their lives in the future.
I'll say this: anything's better than doing nothing and acting as if the problem doesn't exist or that it's someone else's issue. Every now and then, people say to me, I've had people say, hey, why don't you mind your own business? And my response is, this is my neighborhood. It is my business. And, yeah, I can be that. I'm not quite the old guy, get off my lawn kids guy, but I can be that guy. I was that way having dinner with my wife and two young women who were obviously down on their luck, were prostituting themselves on the street, and an old guy came up right next to me at this outdoor restaurant and started talking to him. And I lit into him, and he said, "Why don't you mind your own business?" Which is the number one bad response to say to me. And but I did something about it. We didn't get physical, didn't have to do any of that stuff, and he left. I think that people need to do more of that. Treat it like that's their community. It's their kids.
Yeah, and I think getting involved in the community is really important. I know where I live now, we have, an opportunity to get involved and be a mentor for people. And I think just, I know everybody's busy. We have our own lives and kids. But even, doing programs like that where you're a mentor for somebody that's maybe 12, 13 years old and is struggling, like you can literally change their life. And so really getting involved in your community, I think it is so important. The police are doing their best that they can right now out there, and I really believe in that community. They need to work together. Everyone needs to work together because, the community, the ultimate goal, the safety of the community, we all just need to do a better job of working together. And for those kids out there that are struggling, maybe they have just one parent and they don't see them that much, they could really benefit from those role models in their lives.
I think it's fair to say you've become a bit of a role model for a lot of people. You went through difficult times growing up. Thank goodness your dad helped keep you in a straight and narrow. You went into a career in law enforcement, and your career was ended not by your choice, and probably a lot of people would feel unfairly, but after your legal battles, Janelle, you decided to write about it. How long did it take you to write this book?
It probably took about a year and a half or so. It was quite the, should I do this? Should I not do this? I decided, yes, it was the right thing to do because, when things first came down in the media, I was portrayed one way, and I really felt like I deserved to speak my side of the story and tell the full version. So it was important for me to say what had happened. But it was, it was soul searching. I'm by no means a perfect human being, so I admit my mistakes in the book as well. But I definitely felt it was important for me to share my story and even help other people in similar situations.
I had great sergeants when I was a rookie, and I had a lot of great officers who were old school police. I mean, they were a lot of combat veterans, and they started teaching us, here's how you survive this career, here's how you police, here's how you treat people, and they told us a lot of things not to do. And it strikes me that your book probably contains a bit of both.
Yeah, it's so hard because I support the police and I have met so many amazing police officers. I think, it was hard for me to write because especially like my first agency, I feel such a loyalty to them. But, I felt like it was important. There were, a few people in my book that are mentioned that I feel made mistakes, and it would have been nice for them to own up to them. But I've kind of seen it all throughout this process, and this was my closure, writing this book. So and that was really important.
The book is called The Moral Police. Just do a search on Google or go to Amazon.com and put in The Moral Police. Janelle Perez, thanks so much for your service, and thanks so much for being a guest on the Law Enforcement Show. Very much appreciated.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
A huge thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast version of the Law Enforcement Talk radio show, by the way, which is a nationally syndicated radio show. And we broadcast on over 115 radio stations across the United States to more than 44 million combined population. If you like our show, there's two simple things you can do. Go to our website, letradio.com. Add your favorites. Check it often. You can find episodes of the show right there. And the second one involves our Facebook page. It's so easy to find great content, including past episodes of the show. And when you see something that you like, that resonates with you, be sure to share it with your friends. We'll be back in just a few days with another episode of the Law Enforcement Talk radio show and podcast. Until then, this is John J. Wiley. See ya.